Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Today I have Elizabeth from Proactive with me. Thank you for being with us, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Elizabeth, would you like to tell us a little bit about your role and what you do at Proactive?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Proactive, I am a psychologist. I have a background in both clinical psychology and neuropsychology. And I work with a lot of individuals who have suffered concussion and then get referred through ACC or have other types of injuries as well. And I also work with private clients.
Can you tell us what you're going to talk to us about today?
Yes, so I'm going to talk about the overlay between concussion symptoms and then also psychological symptoms. So emotional side effects that come up with concussion, as well as some cognitive symptoms like memory problems and concentration. I'll talk a little bit about the physiology of concussion just to kind of give a background, and then the different levels of severity of concussion, because there's a lot of information out there about concussion, but sometimes it's hard to know when we undergo head injury to know just how severe it is, especially given that after a head injury, it can often feel very significant. So I'll talk a little bit about concussion severity, and then talk about the importance basically of mindset in recovery and how sometimes problems with depression and anxiety can actually prolong concussion symptoms. And then at the very end, kind of talk about if somebody does ever experience a head injury, maybe when to seek additional help. Well, to kind of start out, I am going to be, again, thank you so much for having me talk about psychology and concussion, because it is a really important component in people's recovery. So when we think about the different aspects of head injury and recovering from head injury, there are a number of different things that come into play. And we think about importance of sleep and nutrition and exercise, but also mindset as a significant factor. So I'm going to talk a little bit basically about how people come to me and then what we work on together. So typically in concussion, somebody will suffer a head injury, go to their GP for symptoms if there are residual symptoms like headache or fatigue or things like that. And the GP will refer to concussion services. And then once within services, an individual will undergo comprehensive assessment. So with Proactive, they'll meet with an occupational therapist, they'll meet with a physiotherapist, and then they'll also undergo, each case undergoes a neuropsychological case review with myself, and then also a medical case review with a physician. And so that's taking a look at medical contributors that might prolong concussion and recommendations about having a further medical intervention. And then also from the neuropsych side, what cognitive and emotional symptoms might need additional treatment and potentially even additional testing. So a lot of times cognitive and emotional symptoms will resolve alongside physical symptoms. So when a person suffers a head injury and they experience headache and fatigue or dizziness, visual disturbances, there's also cognitive symptoms that come up. So problems with concentration, memory problems, really slowed thinking times. People feel like they're kind of in a fog, and also emotional symptoms. People tend to feel like their frustration tolerance is really low and they get super irritable. They can be anxious about the recovery process and feel a lot of stress, and also sometimes depression, and sometimes symptoms of concussion and depression coincide or overlap. So we'll talk a little bit about that. If the nature of the head injury is severe enough, then individuals will often be referred on for additional cognitive testing. So that'll be basically a quick snapshot of things like memory, executive functioning, so like planning, or organizational skills, attention, and then also taking a look at just general verbal and nonverbal intellectual skills, just to kind of make sure that everything is functioning okay. And then from there, we can recommend further treatment or further testing. So I'm going to kind of transition to talking a little bit about the nature of the injury itself. So basically, the first question is, with a head injury and with a referral and an assessment, was a concussion sustained? And one of the difficulties with concussion is that a lot of times when we're determining concussion symptomology and the severity of it, it's really based on a person's ability to accurately tell us about the head injury and to recall the event. So that can sometimes pose a challenge. When we think about the types of head injury, we usually categorize it into mild, moderate, and severe. And typically, when we think about mild, there are two sort of gold standards that we use to categorize. And one is the Glasgow Coma Scale. And the Glasgow Coma Scale is basically, it evaluates just a series of basic eye function, verbal responses, and motor responses, and it's on a scale of 15. So if somebody is able to open their eyes in response to a stimulus, give appropriate verbal and motor responses, on a scale of out of 15, if they have 13 basic functions, that's usually considered pretty mild. Whereas if somebody has a score of somewhere between 9 and 12, that's a more moderate head injury. And then if somebody has a Glasgow Coma Scale of 4 to 6, that's a severe head injury. Another piece that we look at is loss of consciousness, how long that lasts. And typically a mild head injury will usually be about 30 minutes or less. And then the other major component that we look at is post-traumatic amnesia. So when people experience a head injury, a lot of times they'll forget the injury itself or events after the injury. And typically it's considered a mild head injury even if the person forgets events up to 24 hours after. But more than 24 hours to about a week is a moderate head injury, and then more than a week of what we call post-traumatic amnesia is considered severe. So it's important just to kind of keep in mind that a lot of times people will have a head injury, they'll have confusion and disorientation and memory loss, sometimes for hours after the event, and they'll be really, really concerned naturally that it's going to be a lasting injury. But typically, even though the experience of it is quite distressing, that still falls within the mild category of brain injury. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the physiology of concussion too, just to kind of gain an understanding where some of the symptoms come from. I'm not going to get too technical or complex, but just very quickly, there are two major aspects to the physiology of concussion. The first is when there is a mechanical force that results in brain injury. A lot of times what will happen at the cellular level, so with neurons, the cells of the brain, there is a membrane disruption. So basically there is a dysregulation at the cell membrane in what is usually a very delicate balance of ions inside the cell. And so once there is that force to the brain, cell membranes will have a dysregulated flow of ions into and out of the cell membrane. And so things like sodium and potassium and calcium and glutamate, they're just very generally speaking, what is normally very carefully balanced becomes really dysregulated. And so what ends up happening is it causes an energy crisis within the cell. And this is where a lot of symptoms, physical symptoms will come in, like headache, fatigue, sleep difficulties, and also emotional dysregulation as well. And then the other physiological effect of concussion is that within the neuron, there's a part of the cell that extends to the next cell. Basically, it's the messenger part of the cell called the axon. And what will end up happening in concussion is that there's axonal injury. So there is basically some damage or tearing to the axon itself. And so what that ends up is it exacerbates the energy crisis as well. And so from that side of things, we end up having problems with cognition. So things like basically communication between the cells. So problems with memory, concentration, attention, things like that. So that's kind of the physiology behind concussion. And to talk a little bit about sort of basically the broad symptoms of concussion, we can think about it in three categories that I've already touched on. So there's the physical side, which is headaches, fatigue. A lot of times there's problems with balance or vestibular disturbances. There can be problems with vision and problems even with just in general sensory sensitivity. So lights become really bright or sounds become really, really loud because the brain has difficulty filtering out sort of non-essential stimulation. There's the cognitive side of things that we talked about, so memory, so slowed thinking, lack of concentration, even verbal problems like word finding difficulties people will experience after they have a concussion. And then there's the emotional side. So a lot of times people will experience a really low mood after they have concussion because they're feeling tired, they have a headache, and also the cells themselves are dysregulating their emotions themselves, how we experience them. And what we call heightened emotional ability. So like I mentioned before, people will tend to get surprised at how irritated or how quickly they'll become frustrated after a concussion, and that can what we call just a general irritability. So those are sort of the main symptoms of concussion. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that concussion in and of itself is rarely just that organic component. It's rarely just the physiology of disruption to the cell itself. There are many, many psychological factors that contribute to how well a person is able to recover from concussion. And that extends to before the injury itself. So what we think about as the pre-morbid or pre-injury psychological status. So for example, did the person have depression before they had the injury, or did they already have anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll talk a little bit about. There's also, just kind of general personality traits and how people attribute their symptoms attribute the cause of their symptoms. So for example, where we otherwise might go about our day sort of ignoring minor little headaches, or we might have a startle with a loud noise. We might otherwise not pay much attention to it, but after concussion, sort of depending on how we're wired, we can attribute all of those to concussion, which can be very, very worrisome. Another is just a person's general distress and level of reactivity. So a person who tends to be a little bit more pessimistic or tends to be more reactive to some of the things in their environment, they're going to similarly find that with concussion, it might exacerbate some of those symptoms of emotional lability. Also, personal stressors or demands on work, that's a huge one. When people have to face going back to work, or maintaining high achievement in school, those stressors can become a million times greater or feel a million times harder with concussion, and can extend symptom recovery if we don't give ourselves enough time to recuperate. Physical activity is another pre-existing factor in concussion. So for example, people who tend to have pretty low levels of physical activity might withdraw after concussion, and then that can exacerbate recovery as well. And then social supports. It's really important to keep in mind that with concussion, it's important to have other people there for us to be able to help us. So that includes our housing, our extended social networks, keeping in touch with friends and family, which of course is a challenge during this time, being under lockdown, but also, actually that keeping that in mind, sort of the general environmental stress right now of lockdown would be an exacerbating factor in concussion. So all of those kind of come together to play a role in how a person is going to respond to their concussion symptoms and how quickly they'll recover. So, and keeping in mind too, concussion symptoms themselves are really non-specific. And so just like concussion has fatigue and headache and irritability, anxiety also presents anxiety, even without concussion. A lot of times people will experience those things, or stress or depression. People can even experience significant concentration and memory difficulties just with depression or anxiety in and of itself. So it's important to kind of keep in mind that pre-injury psychological conditions will increase the risk to prolonged concussion symptoms. And psychological distress, of course, from concussion is a very common factor. So some studies have shown depression in up to 44% of individuals within the first 3 months. So people will really experience a drop in their mood after a head injury. And other studies have shown that 29% of people have met criteria for an anxiety disorder, and 24% had PTSD from the injury alone, because obviously head injury can often result from a traumatic event, such as a car accident or an assault. So a lot of times concussion will be followed by its own set of psychological distress. And then just kind of keeping in mind too, that because of the physiological injury to the brain, there are certain networks that become particularly vulnerable and make it harder to regulate our emotions. So in addition to experiencing increased symptoms because of what we've been exposed to, it's harder for our brain in some ways to be able to cope with what has happened, whereas otherwise we might have better coping mechanisms in place. So that's where that heightened emotional lability comes in. A lot of times people will talk to me about how all of a sudden they'll be watching a commercial, and a commercial about puppies will come on and they'll find themselves in tears where they would never have done that. So so it's important to keep in mind that psychological factors before the injury can play a role, but there are also emergent psychological factors because of the injury itself. One of my colleagues in Wellington, Josh Faulkner, talked about, because of the energy crisis within the brain and because of what happens at the physiological level, there are psychological factors that basically what he describes as kind of the brain ends up having a very low fuel tank. So whereas before an injury, we would have sort of a fully operating fuel tank to be able to manage stressors, to be able to focus and concentrate and go about our day, after injury, our fuel tank doesn't go very high and it has to constantly reset. So it will get drained very, very easily. And psychological factors can keep the fuel tank low. So a lot of times depression, anxiety, and as I mentioned before, stress often maintain persistent symptoms. So there was a bionic study that found that it's not the characteristic of the injury itself necessarily, so not how severe the mechanical force to the brain was, but often what predicted the worst outcomes in people were the psychological factors after injury: depression, stress, and anxiety. And as well as pre-existing mental health conditions. So how much those kind of carried over after the accident. And this has been pretty consistent in a number of international studies. Also, another thing to think about is just physiologically the effects of stress. And if we already think about the brain kind of being on a low fuel tank after concussion, because it's trying to regulate itself, it's trying to heal its newfound energy crisis. Physiologically, people who have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, they are already sort of vulnerable physiologically. The brain is already affected, and psychologically, their ability to cope with an injury is already compromised. So particularly with PTSD and chronic stress at the time of injury, that can be one of the biggest risks for prolonged symptoms. So we think about recovery. We want to ensure that mindset is really attuned to managing the injury itself and to looking forward to recovery. So my role when clients come to me is to really help clients understand their presentation and the rehabilitation process. And education goes a long way in helping people to de-stress, just to be understood in what they're experiencing, but also for them to have some input into what it is they're experiencing, how long they might expect treatment to take, and also to help people stay positive and keep motivation levels high. And so part of my role is what's called nudge tolerance. So we want to very gently nudge people into activities so that they don't avoid them. But we also don't want to push people too hard so that they fall into what we call a boom and bust, where they end up working very, very hard, sort of pushing themselves beyond their capacity and then being completely drained of energy. So we want to sort of avoid either no activity or too much activity. And my goal is to work with individuals to kind of find the right balance, and also to overcome some obstacles, particularly psychologically, that they might be experiencing. And there's a lot of literature on concussion, especially recently. And sometimes what we hear about concussion can be very frightening. And so what I talked about earlier when we were characterizing concussion in terms of mild, moderate, and severe, a lot of times because of the distress that people will have following concussion with really difficult symptoms of headache and fatigue and memory problems, they'll think that their injury is very, very severe. And what can happen actually is with kind of what's put out there in terms of media and research, and also just a general misunderstanding of the severity of concussion, sometimes what we run into is a nocebo effect. So there's the placebo effect, which is basically a placebo treatment is where there's no actual treatment administered, and it's sort of the psychological effects of the treatment outcome. Nocebo is the worsening of symptoms that develop after placebo treatments. And so nocebo effects in concussion basically arise in response to negative health-related information or beliefs where there's really no specific biological marker but how people perceive the outcome will affect their treatment outcome. So it's really important to be educated about concussion and to know about the significant effects that it has, particularly with repeated concussion. But it's also important to not misattribute some normal background symptoms that people have to concussion on an ongoing basis. So like I said, recent media and research have presented concussion as more hazardous to health than they ever have before because of some new understandings about concussion itself. So it's important. And at the same time, some exposure has led to when, people, especially when people sort of present in my office and they talk about what it is that they're expecting about what's going to happen because of their head injury. It's a little bit of a combination of misinformation and heightened fear around it. So, and evidence from placebo treatments, randomized controlled trials, and basically trials comparing two types of information that have been presented about adverse effects, all have shown that nocebo effects exacerbate or prolong concussion symptoms. So one aspect of that is having negative expectations about concussion. Another is having fear and anxiety about concussion and then misattributing symptoms. So like I mentioned earlier, sort of normally overlooked symptoms during the day might now have, after concussion, might be associated with increased anxiety or fear that they're going to be permanent because of the injury. And then also behavioral avoidance. Like I mentioned before, sort of that nudge effect is to really keep people moving forward in their recovery. A lot of times what will end up happening in concussion is that people will avoid activities that, for example, involve concentration or focus because they're going to fear that it's going to be too much for them, or it'll lead to further injury, or it's going to worsen their symptoms in the long run. And what ends up happening is it actually could lead to ongoing neuroplastic changes or even atrophy if people avoid activities on an ongoing basis. So it's really important to provide people with education about concussion. And there was a study conducted in 2015 that showed that a single psychoeducational session, and when I say that, it's meeting with a person just for one time, is a key factor in preventing or shortening post-concussive symptoms. So it's the most important thing about education is providing somebody reassurance that they're going to be okay. So it's even in one therapeutic session, providing education about the symptoms of concussion, the expected recovery course from concussion, and then the appropriate attribution of symptoms in concussion versus other factors is really, really important. It's also important to provide people education about sort of gradually resuming activities. And that's been found to be really highly effective in reducing symptoms. It also helps to address people's lack of knowledge that they might have simply because they've never had to learn about it before, and helping people face their uncertainty with some support. It also provides, not necessarily given time frames that people are going to recover by, but just very generally speaking, 95% of individuals who experience a mild traumatic brain injury over the course of about 3 months will recover, is sort of the very general time frame that we look at, which can be very, very reassuring to people, especially in those early stages of concussion when symptoms feel really, really severe. It's also important to, a major role of mine is actually to really normalize and validate what people are going through. So they're experiencing emotional distress in a way that they haven't before, and it's important to have support through that. And a lot of times family and friends, they can't see the injury, so they don't really understand the level of distress beneath it. And it's important to have somebody with you kind of walk you through that journey. It's also important within providing some education around concussion to emphasize the impact of non-injury factors. So really working with the person on other factors that might be prolonging their symptoms and just tweaking some things in their in how they manage stress and how they manage their daily routine, in their diet and their exercise, things like that, to help kind of work with the person to parse out what is concussion and what is non-injury related factors. What are non-injury related factors? And then If, reassurance isn't really enough, early psychological input can, again, help to reduce or prevent prolonged symptoms by providing intervention around relaxation strategies, symptom management. So things like diaphragmatic breathing or deep muscle relaxation or progressive muscle relaxation are some of the main tools early on that we provide with for people to reduce some of their stress and to help them learn to what we call regulate their autonomic nervous system. So kind of regain a balance between their sort of rest and digest nervous system paired with their fight or flight. And so just kind of helping them manage their schedule, their activity, and their stress levels to regain a balance between those two systems can really help to prevent long-term symptoms. And so if there's still chronic symptoms, typically I'll meet with a person for concussion services specifically about 4 or 5 times, depending, and not longer than that. But if there are ongoing symptoms, particularly cognitive symptoms, then what we can do is, I mentioned earlier, a neuropsychological screen, which is taking a look at attention, memory, verbal functioning, things like that. We can either do a short snapshot within concussion services, or if there are concerns that are raised within the screen itself, or if the history of the person is very, very complex and symptoms are very persistent or severe, we can also look at doing a full neuropsychological battery, which is taking a much more in-depth look at all of those cognitive domains and seeing what contributing factors might be playing a role in concussion symptoms. So psychological factors play a significant role in concussion, both pre-existing psychological factors before the injury, and then also the cognitive and emotional symptoms that come up after the injury and as a consequence of the injury. So it is important to know to seek help, especially when mood is very, very low, when people are not feeling themselves, when they're noticing significant mood swings, tearfulness, ongoing fatigue, sort of loss of pleasure in everyday activities, especially if people start withdrawing from people around them. Other things to look for would be significant anxiety, so ongoing worry or nervousness, or avoidance of activities, or doing things that you normally would do. So it would be important at that point to reach out and to consult with your GP and to potentially seek psychological services, which we can offer, like I said, tools for symptom management, relaxation strategies, education around concussion, and then just most importantly, emotional support for what you're experiencing. So I really appreciate the Brain Injury Association for having me today, and for Vicki for being very patient with me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I've learned so much. I've been sitting here scribbling down some notes for myself. So I've learned a lot. So I'm sure everybody else has as well. And we really appreciate you being a part of this. It's great to be able to give people some information and a great opportunity while we're all at home to learn something new. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate you being out there, continuing to engage people and getting the information out there. That's incredibly important. So thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.